Welcome everybody to Africa Talks, to our start of the third series, edition number 19. We have further developed the concept of the web talk and want to bring in the African perspective even more than before. I'm therefore very pleased to welcome our new co-host from Namibia, Siphiwe Lutibetsi. Good to have you in the show.
Thank you very much, Marco. Glad to be here. Greetings to you all. I look forward to co-hosting Africa Talks and to discuss African and European topics with the alumni of International Journalist Network, IJP, and our distinguished guests.
Africa Talks is maybe, as you might know, is designed as a digital platform for exchange of knowledge and ideas between journalists and experts from civil society from both continents. We have to talk about chances and challenges, about different realities, and we want to learn, engage, and to discuss. I'm Marco Vollmer. I'm member of the board of the International Journalists Programs, IJP.
And our topic for today is Africa Tomorrow, Pathways to Prosperity. According to the global GDP numbers from the WorldBank, the rest of the world is 6 times richer than Africa, and GDP per person has grown globally at a much faster rate. These numbers do not simply represent the macroeconomic realities that governments in African countries must manage. They also translate to the circumstances in which millions of people live their lives. What are the reasons for this development? What are the possible solutions to change the trend in the years to come? Is disruptive innovation Africa's pathway to grow?
We are going to discuss these questions with our distinguished guest, Jakkie Cilliers. He is a well-known Africa analyst and the founder of the Institute for Security Studies, ISS. He's author of numerous books and bestsellers. He currently serves as chair of the ISS Board of Trustees and head of the African Futures and Innovation Program at the ISS. His 2017 bestseller, Fate of the Nation, addresses South Africa's futures from political, economic, and social perspectives. His 2 most recent books, Africa First, Igniting a Growth Revolution, March 2020, and The Future of Africa, Challenges and Opportunities from April 2021, takes a rigorous look at the continent as a whole. In his brand new book, Africa Tomorrow, Pathways to Prosperity, he will explore how important development trends are unfolding across time by analyzing variables like agriculture, education, economics, energy, the environment, governance, health, infrastructure, and international politics. Welcome, Jakkie. We are very much honored to have you on Africa Talks.
Thank you very much for the invitation and look forward to the chat.
We would also like to let our viewers know that one of our colleagues, Verushka Bon, who is our graphic recorder, will be taking graphic notes of this talk. Now, thank you, Verushka. Now let's jump into our third series of Africa Talks. We have asked Jakkie to kick off our talk by giving us a short impulse and an outlook on future trends for the African continent. Jakkie, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, and again, thanks for the invitation. So I'm going to share a screen, and everything I'm going to show you is on the website that we designed and that we host. I very often, and it actually Siphiwe ties into what you started off, start my presentations by showing this chart. It is GDP per capita in Africa at the bottom, and in the rest of the world at the top. It is from 1960, and it includes a forecast until 2043. The data is about until 2021, and you can see the impact of COVID here. And you can immediately see the issue that Siphiwe referred to and that we try to address, which is the growing gap between average levels of income or GDP per capita between Africa and the rest of the world. So to try and address this issue, we have spent many years and lots of time in developing a website, and this is the front page of that website, that is really looking at the long-term future of Africa across various dimensions. The website provides an integrated set of forecasts on Africa's development potential. So we do the work now in partnership with Order NEPAD, which, as you know, is the development partner or the development program of Africa. There's a lot of detail on this website, but it allows you to look at the future of any African country, and you can just click on the country, on any African region like North Africa, West Africa, Southern Africa, or any of the 8 regional economic communities that the Africa Union recognizes. Or you can look at the various income groups. You know, according to the World Bank, Africa has 23 low-income countries, 23 low-middle-income countries, 7 upper-middle-income countries, and 1 high-income country, which is the island of Seychelles. Now, one way to look, therefore, at the future of Africa is to click on one of these geographies, and then you will get to quite a long set of charts. There are actually 60 charts with text for every African country. And we look at Africa, we look at where we think Africa is headed on its so-called current path, or the business as usual forecast. Then for every of 11 scenarios, we model a single aggressive positive scenario. So what the site tries to do is it tries to look out till 2043, which is our forecast horizon, and says, what is the impact of more stability or a demographic dividend on the future of Africa? The reason for 2043 is that is the end of the 3rd 10-year implementation plan of the Africa Union's vision known as Agenda 2063. So we look at what is the impact, what could be the impact of more stability, a demographic. We know that stability is a prerequisite for other things. Getting to a demographic dividend. Africa is about 30 years away from entering its demographic dividend. What would be the impact of an agricultural revolution? Africa talks a lot about agriculture, but it's never had an agricultural revolution. What would be the impact of investments in health and wash infrastructure, water and sanitation? A healthy population obviously is more productive. What is the impact of more and better education? In education, quality is more important than quantity in our modeling, in our forecasting. It always is the case almost. Then we look at the impact of a manufacturing revolution. No rich country has become rich without industrializing, and the same holds for Africa. We also model the impact of free trade. In actual fact, what we do there is we look at the full implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area. Then we look at the potential of leapfrogging. Many people believe that somehow there's some magic technological bullet that will alter Africa's development prospects. And we look and we investigate and we model the impact of all of these factors on Africa's future. We look at the impact of more and better financial flows, consisting of 4 elements: more remittances, more aid, more foreign direct investment, and less outward illicit financial flows. That's what we call financial flows. We look at more investment in infrastructure. Much of that is built by China. We look at better governance or better accountability. And then we measure these 11, we compare these 11 scenarios on carbon emissions and the impact on climate change. And we look at the impact of jobs. And then, as I indicated, we combine these scenarios in an Agenda 2063 combined scenario. So let's look at what our combined scenario would say for the future of Africa. So I'm just going to jump to this chart. This chart is, again, a chart that is in constant 2017 US dollars. It is from 2019 till 2043. And this is the average, or this is our forecast for GDP per capita growth in Africa from 2019. You can see the impact of COVID here out till 2043. So Africa by 2043 would get to a GDP per capita of about $7,157. But if Africa does all the 11 things that we are saying it potentially needs to do, it could almost double GDP per capita to over $11,000. And those scenarios, let me remind you, is what is the impact of getting to a demographic dividend? What is the impact of an agricultural revolution on GDP per capita? What is the impact of better governance or more accountability? what is the impact of, let me just click on the right thing, of leapfrogging? What is the impact of better education, more stability, manufacturing transition, the implementation of the Continental Free Trade Area, and then there is a combined, if you do all of those things, you get an extra kick, which we refer to as the synergistic impact. So that is, if you have a well-educated, healthy population, they are more productive. So 1 + 1 = 3, and that's sort of that impact. So that's what we model on the website. There are 60 charts for every of the geographies. But of course, we don't live in an ideal world, because what we've done on this website is we've modeled, in actual fact, what is Africa's potential in what we refer to as a sustainable world. So let me go back to where I was listing the various charts, the various interventions, and then say, after we've done the analysis of the combined Agenda 2063 scenario, I've just showed you the results of that for Africa as a whole. But what is the impact of the world out there on Africa's development? So this is something that we modeled and added to the website about a month ago. And I'm going to take you there, and let's look at what developments in the rest of the world have on the impact of Africa. So let me click there, and let's look at these 4 worlds that we have modeled. So we have modeled the impact of Africa in a sustainable world, a divided world, a world at war, and a growth world. And I'm going to start off by referring to those summaries. I'm going to jump around on the website a little bit while I show you that. But let's first go to the summary of the 4 global scenarios. So remember, scenarios are not predictions. We try and provide a framework that allows you to look at the future of the world. And we say that there are 4 potential futures for the world. There is a sustainable world, which is the world that we have modeled on this website. You can look at some of the features on this ideal world, which is, of course, is the most difficult to achieve. But we are probably headed for this world, a divided world, which is a world that is fragmented. There's a retreat from the rules-based order. Somebody like Donald Trump is elected in 2024. The US and the EU don't pull in the same direction. There's the ongoing delegitimation of the UN Security Council, and so on. Weak mitigation and adaptation, xenophobia and anti-migrant sentiments. So that's the kind of world. And each of these worlds is associated with an African scenario. So if I then show you what the African scenarios that are associated with each of these worlds, these are the scenarios that hold for each of those global worlds. So in a sustainable world, Africa gets more aid remittances, the Continental Free Trade Area is fully implemented, democracy deepens, there's regular elections. But in the current trajectory towards a divided world, there is no clear African voice. African allegiances differ, Africa's development stalls, and so on. And this is more or less where we think the current trajectory is where we are headed. Let me briefly show you what is the impact of these different worlds on, for example, GDP per capita. So I started off by showing you that chart, quite alarming chart of the growing gap that is between GDP per capita in Africa and GDP per capita in the rest of the world. So this chart gives you the same analysis. It's just for a shorter historical period. It's from 2000 until 2043. This is GDP per capita in the rest of the world under those 4 scenarios: the world at war, the divided world, the sustainable world, and the growth world. And this is GDP per capita in Africa, which of course is lowest in the world at war and is highest in the sustainable world. So this is one way to look at those scenario outcomes. Another way to look at those scenario outcomes would be to look at what is the impact on carbon emissions. So this is global carbon emissions under each of those 4 scenarios, as we would expect. Although the global economy is much smaller, this is what happens in the growth world, in the world at war. Small global economy, but large carbon footprint. Growth world has the largest carbon emissions. This is by 2043 in billion tons of carbon. This is our current trajectory towards a divided world and a sustainable world. So that's one way of looking at the future of Africa. Another way would be to look at the impact of extreme poverty in each of these scenarios. So the left-hand side of this chart that I'm showing you shows extreme poverty in Africa in percent of the African population, top, and percent in the rest of the world. Africa, what are we? 2022, about 35% of Africans live in extreme poverty, and in the world at war, it will be about 21% by 2043. It could be as low as 5.8%. And this is the same data on the right-hand side, showing extreme poverty in millions of people. So Africa at the moment has, what is it, about 525 million Africans living in extreme poverty. So I'm going to jump with that, to sort of the main takeaways from the study of Africa and the world that we've done, and just quickly talk you to that. There are 10 top takeaways. We started off by looking at where power is going globally. And in collaboration with our colleagues from the University of Denver, we use their modeling platform for this work. When we look at material power, we find that China will overtake the US as the most powerful country in the world before mid-century. China is rising. It's almost impossible to stop that. But the West, consisting of Europe and North America, will dominate and maintain a technological and wealth advantage, even over a possible China-Russia axis. So power is shifting, but the West remains dominant. Of course, we don't do prediction, we do scenarios. Events that could really change this is the democratization of China, which would be hugely disruptive, particularly for Africa, because it would probably be accompanied by considerable turmoil. And China is Africa's largest trading partner. And of course, we have this ongoing political polarization in the United States. And then what could happen with the EU? It could contract, another Brexit, with obviously other countries, or it could expand to maybe include a democratic Russia and Turkey. Or we could see the political integration of Asia following its economic integration. The third is that, of course, if the West is to maintain its technological and wealth advantage, the relations between the US and the EU is absolutely critical. Of course, also what happens with India, although India's rise is still quite slow. The war in Ukraine and the fear of China's rising influence is having significant collateral effects. And we believe that what is hugely important for Africa is that the West needs to differentiate between China and Russia and resist simplistic narratives that put a benevolent West against a bad China associated with an evil Russia in Africa. And the reason is because Africa needs China, the European Union, and the US. It cannot and should not choose the one above the other. They bring different goodies to the table. The sixth is just sort of a general statement, and that is that the Chinese Communist Party will not abandon or change its views, collectivist views on politics and development, while on the other hand, Western countries will not abandon their belief in individual freedoms and rights. And what is needed is a determined effort to rebuild relations between the West and China and acknowledge the differences and approaches to development and governance. That is, of course, what Europe is trying to do. 7, Africa should pursue the sustainable world scenario. If you looked at that growing gap and you look at the challenges, the multi-generational challenges that lie ahead, we need to avoid being instrumentalized, and we need to pursue the evolution of a next generation rules-based global system. The current rules-based global system was developed by the West for the West. It maintains the wealth of the rich, and it constrains developing regions like Africa. But of course, not all African leaders are committed to national development. Countries like Eswatini, Equatorial Guinea, and many others are just not part of this, and some are unable to participate. Let's think of countries in the Sahel or Somalia. So we recommend and think that Africa must embark on a two-speed approach, where some countries commit earlier to higher standards of governance than others. Of course, easier said than done. So this is a summary of the takeaway of our, sort of a summary of our conclusion. If this is the sustainable world, then the divided world that we are headed for means that carbon emissions will be 4% higher. GDP per capita will be 6% lower. Extreme poverty will be 48% higher in Africa compared to the sustainable world scenario. So the divided world trajectory places a constraint and constrains Africa's potential. So Africans need to relentlessly pursue their interests, including on the conditions for foreign investment, insist on knowledge transfers and domestic linkages. We can learn a lot from the way that China has managed the developed world, provide full transparency on government contracts, and resist political conditionality, whether that is on Ukraine or that is on Taiwan. And finally, if the West is to retain influence and assist Africa, it must de-risk investments by bank and the private sector. Again, easy said. China doesn't have this problem. But private capital, we need to find a way of unlocking private capital to invest in Africa. The West needs to commit to ongoing engagement, communication, and greater visibility of Africa's development prospects in Europe and North America. China does that. The US, Europe is waking up, but much more needs to be done. Of course, most important is to reset relations with China and lead on a relaunched multilateral system and an investment-oriented growth model that benefits Africa. So I've tried in this presentation to provide you with an idea of Africa's development potential and what can be done to change its current trajectory and to move towards what we refer to as a sustainable world. And I've concluded by trying to give you an idea of what the global constraints are and what globally needs to happen. So apologies if I've spoken too long, but I'll stop there and hopefully we can have an interesting discussion.
Thank you very much, Jakkie. And I think you presented really impressive data and alarming figures, on the other hand, when it comes to the future perspectives of the African continent and of the African countries. In June, at the launch of this of your new website, which you just have guided us through, your president, South Africa's president, Cyril Ramaphosa, he commended the ISS for, and I quote, "landing its weight to the Pan-African drive for unity, self-determination, freedom, progress, and collective prosperity." You just pointed out why the continent is trailing behind the rest of the world's improvement in livelihoods. Is there still hope? Is there still hope for improvement?
Yes, I think there is. Remember that I'm presenting data. And data, data is debatable, but generally I don't think the trends lie. So things are improving in Africa, and it's very important to reflect that, but it's improving more rapidly elsewhere. And there are some countries in Africa that are amongst the world's most rapidly growing economies. And we all know about Africa's potential in IT and a source of minerals for the fourth industrial revolution and so on and so forth. So things are improving in Africa, but if we want to start closing the gap between general average levels of income, then Africa has to do all of these things. And what I think is important about our work is to underpin the structural differences in Africa's growth trajectory and what needs to happen. You know, many in the West, and particularly in developed countries, believe that all that needs to be done is we need to unlock the private sector and that will develop Africa. Africa needs much more than that. Europe's development trajectory is a development trajectory that has gone from the Industrial Revolution through war that created nationalism, and nationalism is basically a prerequisite for development. Africa had none of this. So it's a long road, but it is a road that is quite hopeful in many years. So I think there's positive news. I have presented on the trajectory, and that people often look at that initial graph and then they say, we didn't realize that growing gap, but that's what the data shows us.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Sipiwe?
Thank you, Marco and Jakkie, to have the greatest impact and for us to move towards a sustainable world, which of the 11 thematic areas should we focus on first?
Very good question. So it depends on your level of development. Of course, it differs from country to country. So our forecasts are done with the individual country level. But I can, and there we have to look at what the situation for Namibia would be, for South Africa, or whichever. And we've done that analysis. But generally, let me generalize and make the point that for Africa's low-income countries, the 23 low-income countries, in the next 10 years, it's agriculture. And then if you take a longer term horizon, right, it is the full implementation of the Continental Free Trade Area. And the reasons for those two are quite obvious. Africa has never had an agricultural revolution. We talk a lot about agriculture, but we don't do that much. But agriculture is foundational to development, food security, and it provides the basis for the next step, which is then manufacturing. But so first, in the next 10 years, next decade, it's agriculture. And then over long term, it's the Continental Free Trade Area, because we don't have a large market. That's the history, that's the secret of the European Union, of the United States, of India and China. We have 55, 54 small domestic markets. And if you want to build scale, you need larger market. For the 7 upper middle income countries, including South Africa, my country, it is firstly in the next 10 years manufacturing, industrial transition, and then also the full implementation of the Continental Free Trade Area that will give you the largest increase in GDP per capita and the largest decrease in extreme poverty.
Okay, great. Thank you. Michael?
And maybe staying on that point, you just mentioned, Jakkie, what would you say, like, or you just pointed out, like that there are other countries who are also improving at the moment, and still I have the feeling that the African continent is much more behind than other regions, other areas. And I know you are not the analyst for more or less all reasons, yeah. But you just observing,
Yeah.
you are just analyzing data. But from your point of view, why is Africa not improving faster? You just mentioned, for me, one argument is you have a growth of people. You have a growth rate of people which is impressive. That could be an advantage. It could also be a disadvantage. But like, this is only one point and one indicator here. And I wonder why we always learn more or less the same data over years. What is your answer?
Okay, so you've put your finger on one of the most fundamental issues, which is demographics. Remember, I started my introduction when I pointed to demographics. I said Africa is 30 years away from entering its demographic dividend. Now let's think of the typical population pyramid. You know, old people at the top, young people at the bottom. When your ratio of working age people to dependents, that is people 15 to 65, to dependents, elderly and the children, when that gets to a ratio of 1.7 working age people to dependents, you start getting a population pyramid that looks like the Taj Mahal. It's nice and fat in the middle. That's when you grow. Africa only gets to that point in 2052. Until 2052, our population pyramid looks like the Eiffel Tower. It's broad at the bottom. And because you have so many children coming through your system, your economy grows, but your incomes do not grow. Demographics is destiny, is often said, and it's very true. One of the most underestimated reasons why Africa is not growing is because it has such a young, rapidly growing population. We can grow the African economy, but we're not growing average wealth. And there are many other reasons. Most of Africa's developmental challenges are rooted in the imposed statehood. You know, in Europe, I made this reference a bit earlier. This is now a second reason. Nationalism preceded development. This is almost true everywhere in the world. In Africa, you have an imposed state through colonialism. So development is done at the behest of a single family or a ruling tribe, if you're Kenyan, or whatever the case may be. You don't have a common vision of where the country should go. You only find that, by the way, In Europe, that was created through war. War made the state, and the state made war, in the famous words. And that is, in a sense, how you created France and Germany and all of these. And that also would have happened in much of the East, but it hasn't happened in Africa. You have tribes put together, lines drawn on a map, growing population that was basically extended for extraction. All the infrastructure was built, and so on. So one can carry on pointing to the reasons. But at the end of the day, Africans need to seize their future, because only Africa will develop Africa. I mean, we need foreign direct investment, we need trade and all those kind of things, but it is us that must change the conditions that will allow a more rapid development.
Staying on that point, talking about the population, I'd like to ask, how can Africa use or work with the young population as an asset for growth? And what lessons can Africa learn from other continents like Europe and Asia about increasing the ratio of working age people to dependents in order to experience the growth?
Great question. So, changes in your population are driven by changes in values, urbanization, education, being part of the formal economy, and these things take time. But eventually they have extraordinary benefits. One of the reasons why China and the Asian tigers grew so rapidly is that they peaked at an extraordinarily high demographic dividend. Actually, they had peaked at about 2.8 working age people to every dependent. Africa will peak at about 2.1 in about 2070. So a long time into the future, which tells you that Africa will never grow as rapidly as China. But never, that's getting sidetracked there. What we need to do is we need to get on top of our demographics, also for climate change purposes, because a larger population that consumes more leads to carbon emissions. But the way to do that, firstly, of course, is female empowerment, but that takes time. The short term, roll out modern contraceptives, because there's a huge unmet demand in Africa. Education, urbanization, part of the formal economy, all also play a role, but particularly in countries like Angola to Namibia's north, Uganda, Tanzania, Kenya, even the DRC, we've done studies in all these countries. You really need, for the long term, you need to get on top of your demographics, but there's much more. All those 11 things that I showed need to happen. You need to educate your people, you need to engage in an agricultural revolution, but the scenarios that have the most impact are the ones that I've mentioned: agriculture, the continental free trade area. Then after that, it's generally leapfrogging for most African countries. And of course, all of those things. There's no silver bullet. We have to do all of those things, and it will take time.
Mm-hmm. And that makes it so complicated, if I may add this. Yes. I think because the situation and the challenges are so complex. When it comes now to maybe the European African axis, so these both continents, I would say, still underestimated in a way which we could achieve here. And I wonder, and I would like to ask you, in which policy areas do you see common grounds between Europe and the African continent, and where, from your point of view, are the biggest obstacles?
So Europe and Africa are bound by the hip. We are bound by geography, by language, by our colonial history, by the Mediterranean Sea, which the best way to look at that is it's a superhighway between North Africa and Europe, by our minerals and also we cannot escape that. And what is very concerning is the extent to which populism and populist nationalism in Europe and the swing to the right is leading, and Africa's potential and population growth is leading to a rise in xenophobia and so on. Because Europe has a declining population, Africa has a rapidly growing population, and I am very concerned that the issue of xenophobia and migration, although very little comes from Africa, will continue to be a drag on development, on our relations. What Europe needs to do firstly is to engage with Africa, to show Africa's potential, let's take North Africa. With all due respects, if the Germans weren't so stupid as to get all their gas from Russia, they could have gotten all their electricity from North Africa. And you had a company, Desert Tech, who for many years was trying to push this. And
we tried.
I
to
know.
push it.
And it will also develop the whole of North Africa. It will industrialize North Africa. Of course, it's easy to say this, but that potential is, for example, one example of the potential that Africa has. Take another example, which you probably know about, which is the Grand Inga scheme, which is supposed to be the largest single hydroelectric project in Africa. Of course, all kinds of issues with hydroelectricity, but you can now use you can build the Grand Inga scheme, which can produce 40 gigawatts of power, and you can convert at source, use that electricity to create hydrogen, pack it in a ship it to Europe. You get away from all the problems with electricity lines and so on and so forth. And then almost all the minerals for the fourth industrial revolution are to be found literally in one country, the DR Congo. So there are many areas, and we are the largest growing unexplored market in the world, Africa. Yes, we come from a low base, but manufacturing is shifting away from where things are made to the customer. And I think that there is huge potential for companies that look long-term. And you only have to look at what Google, formerly Facebook, and all of these companies are doing. They're all coming to Africa. Why? Because they look long-term, and they realize that there is huge market potential on the continent.
Allow me one additional question, CP, before we come to the strategic partnership complex of our question catalog, because you mentioned it, like especially the hydrogen is a thrilling issue at the moment in Germany, as you said. How could we be successful, especially with that energy in this energy sector? What is your opinion here?
Okay, I'm not an energy expert, but the potential of the continent is massive, particularly on renewables. And we have, just by the way, of course, the potential that Africa can make a direct transition into renewables. It won't go through coal, oil, and gas. It will need some of that, particularly gas, but there's huge potential with that. And there are countries, Namibia is one example, is a country that very easily can move completely onto renewables. But we need to have a step change in our thinking. We are, particularly in the developed world, locked into a particular path dependency where you've spent billions of euros in building a central electricity grid and system, and you don't fully perhaps can benefit from decentralized off-grid renewable systems that can give power to local Africans, because there are two prerequisites for really helping Africa, and the one is electricity access across the whole of Africa, and then building on that is internet access, because only if you have those two can you leapfrog, because internet access is crucial for education and agriculture and all of those kind of things. So, and Europe can help with all of those things. Europe can help with project management. It can help with unlocking foreign direct investment and so on and so forth. So there are many, many areas that Europe can and should be investing in Africa in its own interest.
Thank you. How would you assess the opportunities for laying the foundation for a new strategic partnership between both continents? And what should be the core of that strategic partnership?
I think visibility and knowledge is probably the most important thing. Africa has got a bad reputation, put it bluntly. We are considered the continent of violence, instability, corruption, you name it, humanitarian assistance, and so on. But if you do a real detailed analysis of the continent, then the number of conflict areas are relatively few, but they are recurring and they persistent. But the large tract of Africa that is peaceful and that is developing never gets mentioned. So I think the first important thing is to get communication going, and not only political communication, but regular trade fairs, exchange of students, knowing one another. Africans look with longing at the stability and the richness of Europe, and they should be studying there. They should be educated there. And of course, what is happening is most are increasingly going to China because Europe is closing down. North America has already closed down. If you just look long-term at the impact, the potential challenge that this massive youth bulge and population bulge in Africa will have, Europe's population is stagnant. And one can talk about Europe's need for labor. We have an oversupply, and Europe has got a declining labor force. So there are. So I'm mentioning a number of areas, but I think the most important is demystifying Africa as a tourist destination and getting those communications going, and getting the German companies, the companies all over Europe, to understand and to then able to invest in Africa. So I come back to the point about de-risking private sector investment and finding ways to unlock private sector capital flows into Africa. That's, I'm not a financier or a banker or whatever, and I don't know how that is, but that's where governments can play a role. And modern technology means that it's easier to make money at lower returns. I always use the example of if you can now drill a borehole in a slum in Nairobi, in Kibera slum, and you can put a IT system on top of it that it pumps water for a few shilling in Kenya, and people can buy water for household use from a borehole, and it's a commercial project. Whereas, 10 years ago, you didn't have the technology to do that. So modern technology means that your entry point for private sector into Africa is steadily coming lower. Let's use another example. Europe took a long time to give everybody a postal address and a street address that they could get a postman to deliver something. Well, we have drones, we have GPS. Every African with a phone, in theory, can have a bank account and address and can get order from whatever, the local store for a delivery, maybe not Uber Eats, but whatever he can have. So it sounds fanciful, but modern technology allows lots of rapid development that allows you in certain areas to skip over the postal system, the telephone system, maybe even eventually some aspect of having roads and infrastructure if you have heavy lift drones and so on. So technology can really make a huge difference on the continent.
And I understand you're right when you're talking about leapfrogging. These are examples, I think, for leapfrogging on a very basic, pragmatical way.
Yes, exactly.
We just tackled the issue with the hydrogen question, but I would like to paint the bigger picture. The climate crisis, and in particular the green transition, are also to play a key role in the coming years.
Yes.
Yes. What needs to be done here? Should Africa and Europe here join forces, and how could they?
Oh, on so many areas. Europe, in many areas, is the leader when it comes to the green transition. And we, as we've said, can move directly, particularly through renewables, off-grid systems, mini grids. We can move directly into a renewable, into an economy where we can bypass the vested investment in oil pipelines and all of that kind of stuff. We can, and this is an area. Let's take wind farms and solar as the two obvious examples. Africa, there's something, electricity access in Africa, something like 54%. There's something like 600 million Africans that don't have electricity access. It's a huge market. And remember, electricity access, and then on top of that, internet access are foundational to Africa's development. So we have to find a way of, again, unlocking private sector investment, but we also need to build government capacity in Africa. The model that Africans would like to pursue, it's not the Chinese model or the US model, it's the North European model of a social democratic, or so whatever the different terms that you use for social market economy and so on. But that is the model. that is most appropriate and that should be the dominant model for Africa, which is a model where the government looks after the people looks after government, there's trust, government helps and invests, and there is much that can be done in that area, I think.
Thank you for that. The EU has ambitious plans, including the 150 billion euro investment package, the Global Gateway Africa-Europe investment package, to accelerate the green and digital transition, sustainable growth and decent jobs, strengthen health systems, and promote education and training. How promising do you think that this investment package is?
Well, I think it's a huge step in the right direction. Africa needs much more than that. And I think there is always the concern that what is happening is that Europe is, in one sense, waking up to the competition from China, which is now our largest trading partner, although collectively, as a single country, collectively trade with Europe is much larger. And of course, the value component of Africa's trade with Europe is much higher. So those the package that the EU is putting on the table is very, very welcome. We must make it work. We must make a success of that, because it provides one step in this building of the foundation of an Africa that eventually becomes self-sustaining in terms of growth and development. So the Europeans have listed all the key sectors that Africa needs help on. And I think the devil, as always, will be on implementation, because that's where we have problems and where we struggle and where corruption and all these kind of issues come. But, you know, the Chinese work in Africa. China is now becoming one of the major sources of manufacturing in Africa for Africa. China can build infrastructure and do all of these kind of things. Why can't the rest of the world? And by the way, why can't Africans? So I think that the developed world model is very difficult to apply in Africa. But previously, when we were talking a little bit about leapfrogging, I listed a number of examples of where technology and these kind of things can play a role. Of course, the problem in much of Europe, in much of the world, is that manufacturing has all been outsourced to China. There's now a bit of reshoring and so on and so forth. But Africa is, after all, the market of the future. And that in itself, if you're an early mover, that's where you will come, to establish yourself and to try and find a foothold in this massive market that hopefully in the next 10 or 15 years will be one single integrated market. And if you don't come early enough, then, well, I'm afraid the Chinese and everybody else from Asia are going to be here and will have locked up the market. And there's also normative issues and global policy issues that are of importance for Africa. We are 55 countries. We are a huge bloc at the UN and everywhere else. And if you're looking at the future of the rules-based system, or what the developed world like to refer to as the liberal order, the liberal international order, Africa may not be wealthy, but our numbers and the number of countries that all have voting rights and an influence, together with the rise of the South, means that you will need Africa to determine the rules for the future. Or do you want those rules to be set by China or by Russia? So Africa is a very important swing region for the evolving global order, whatever nature that may take.
You mentioned a magic word, implementation, and you mentioned the role of China. When we look from the European perspective, when we look on China, we see, and you said they are building infrastructure all over the African continent, which is right. But we see they're moving in with their people, going to African countries, bringing their workers with them, and doing infrastructure, yes, with hard contracts. And I wonder whether there could be another way of dealing with these things, of building up infrastructure, of doing things with a European way, in focusing also on values, on other things, which are different to the Asian or to the Chinese way. What would you answer on that?
Well, I'd say firstly that the description that you gave of Chinese practices in Africa are a little bit out of date. There's quite a bit of research that indicates the extent to which China employs mostly Africans to do the work today. It wasn't the case 10 years or so ago. Because China has responded to the criticism exactly of indebtedness, of sometimes they brought in convicts and all kinds, but those days really are past. China sees Africa as a strategic partner, partly because it's isolated elsewhere in the world. So China is really investing in Africa. But with that investment, and you referred to that in your in the final part of your question, is it's bringing norms and standards. Let's take issues around privacy and data access that are really problematic, I think, if you believe in democracy and human rights and good governance. And Europe sets the gold standard in many of these areas. Also on copyright and a variety of other areas. So when it comes to setting the standards for that future, do you want the standards to be set by Huawei, or do you want them to be set by Siemens, just for the where companies are on a stock market? There is private sector, there is oversight, there is all those things that go alongside with the institutions that reflect a democracy and a developed world. And therefore, the norms that are being set in Africa and what we are doing is very important. And China, in a sense, China invested in Africa on infrastructure because it had surplus companies and surplus money. Those days are gone. China is, in a sense, moved out of that price advantage that it has to, and other companies, Indian and Indonesian, Turkish, and other companies are coming into Africa because China is no longer as competitive as it used to be. And Europe, of course, it hasn't built that scale of infrastructure that the Chinese have built. And many things we can say. And China often builds infrastructure that is appropriate. It's maybe not the highest standard, and it may not look the best, and it may not have done the environmental impact, but it's a bridge and it works. and it's very often the cheapest. So there are areas where Europe has an advantage, and it's not a choice. Africa, remember, we need all of that. We need Europe as a partner, as a market, and you need us, and the same holds for China and the United States. And that goes back to the positioning of Africa in this emerging global world order, and that is, we don't want to be instrumentalized. We don't want to be forced to make a choice, because in a sense we can't. Yeah, sorry, I'm rattling on there.
Thank you. Whether the support comes from Europe or from China, you had mentioned that implementation is a problem from our side, from the African side. Do you have any insight in mitigating or dealing with this problem?
So, the quality. So we've done quite a bit of work on governance and forecasting governance and so on. So, Africa, so we make the argument there are sort of three components to the creation of the state. You need a stability, you need to create stability, you need capacity, and then eventually you need inclusion. But that trajectory is a developmental function. You don't have good governance and then you develop. That is ahistorical. You develop, and then over time your governance improves. And what Europe and the West often wants is, they say, why don't you guys just stop being corrupt and stop being poorly governed, and then you will develop. Well, that's not happened anywhere in the world. You go back to the United States or to Europe before the Second World War. The United States was a gangster state. It had all kinds of advantages, and over time, people, through accountability, built the institutions and the systems. But Africa is corrupt. Africa doesn't have the institutions, because it is unstable because it is poor. If it wasn't poor, it wouldn't be unstable. The relationship between instability, for example, poor governance, and poverty, it's a direct relationship. And Africa will not change unless Africa becomes richer, or it changes as Africa develops. So one must look at governance in a sense as a function of development. There are many things that can be done to improve the quality of governance and the quality of institutions in Africa. But democracy, particularly liberal democracy, it's a rich man's game. Or a rich woman's game. It is a requirement, it is accompanied by countries that have achieved a certain level of income, and they have the money for the institutions and everything else. What we are doing in Africa, and it's actually borne out by data, we are more democratic than you would expect generally, given our level of GDP and education. Africa has what we refer to as a democratic surplus, and Europeans always get, oh, what does this mean? And it just means that whereas in Asia and elsewhere, you have development followed by democracy, in Africa you have democracy that, in a sense, precedes development in many African countries. This is a real challenge for the continent. Any case,
Thank you. I think I could listen to you for hours because you are so well explaining these big issues and these complex things. But let me end with one last short question. Would you see the potential, and which could it be, of a disruptive innovation coming from the African continent in the next years?
Well, remember that the richest man in the world, Elon Musk, comes from Pretoria, where I stay. I'm not sure if that is good or bad, because he's quite a controversial guy. I think the innovation in Africa probably could come through the IT sector, because Africa, there's a tremendous buzz, also culturally. But when it comes to real high tech, we don't have the capacity. You know, when you're talking of the kind of things that Elon Musk is now doing in the US, SpaceX, and so on and so forth. So I think if you look where some of the innovations came from, let's think of mobile money, M-Pesa, that came from Kenya. That's the kind of innovations that have changed the world. So those kind of almost earth-shattering changes have their origins in Africa. And I think that kind of innovation will still come. And I think the other area where it will come through is the energy transition, where you will find eventually this direct transition to renewables, distributed systems, that prove that development is about independence. It is about making societies, individuals, households independent of the state, and that they find their own pathway to grow and to educate.
Thank you very much, Jakkie. Like Marco said, we could listen to you the whole day. This is the 19th edition of Africa Talks with the theme, Africa Tomorrow, Pathways to Prosperity. I believe we have learned a lot from our distinguished guest, Jakkie Cilliers.
Yeah, also from my side, Jakkie, many thanks for your insights. I just show, this is the picture. This is your new book, Africa Tomorrow. It looks like, and I think you can order it in Europe via Amazon or others. This is all possible.
You can get it free on our website.
Or you can get
open
it free
access
on the website.
You can download it. Yeah,
exactly. So thank you very much to have you on the show. I may say that we have next week another edition of Africa Talks. Then we have the war in Ukraine. How can Africa and Europe face the dramatic consequences? Looking forward to discussing that with policy experts like Melanie Müller and Tim Ndiagi. This was Africa Talks edition 19. Thank you very much, Jakkie Cilliers. Goodbye. Take care and stay healthy.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. Bye-bye.